Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving deep into something that, well, it sparks a lot of curiosity, but it's also, for many people, really personal and sensitive.
Absolutely. We're talking about the experience of joining, living within, and then figuring out life after being involved with groups often called cults.
Yeah, and cult itself is such a loaded word, isn't it? Our sources today make it pretty clear right off the bat that defining it isn't simple.
That's right. We've got two main sources we're drawing on. One is a qualitative study, really interesting, interviewing 10 former members of Bible-based groups, so direct accounts there.
Okay.
And the other is a thoughtful personal essay that reflects more broadly on, the nature of these groups and this idea of a cult mentality.
And that definition problem you mentioned is, yeah, it's a big one. One source says flat out there's no single agreed upon definition.
Exactly. And the line between, say, an unconventional group, maybe a new religion, and a cult, well, it can be really blurry.
I mean, historically, you think about early Christians, they were definitely seen as a cult by the Romans.
Precisely. So maybe instead of getting bogged down by the label, it's more helpful, like the study suggests, to look at the common features, the structures, the dynamics, and how people actually experience being inside them.
Right. So our goal today, our mission for this deep dive, is really to understand, from the perspectives in these sources, what pulls people in. What's it like inside? Why is leaving so hard? And what does recovery look like?
Let's start at the beginning then, joining. What actually leads someone to join one of these groups? There's this stereotype, isn't there, that people who join must have, serious pre-existing psychological problems.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
But the study we looked at, it kind of pushes back on that. It found the rate of people seeking therapy before they joined was only slightly higher than average. So major mental health issues weren't necessarily the main reason for most of them.
Okay, interesting. So if it's not usually about some deep-seated issue or illness, what is driving it, according to these sources?
Timing seems really key. Participants often talked about joining during a kind of gap in life,
A gap, like what when?
like a time of transition, maybe feeling uncertain about the future, actively searching for something, loneliness, maybe some depression, and just that basic human urge to belong. Those were big factors.
That makes sense. You know, being at a crossroads, feeling a bit lost, an offer of community and answers would feel pretty good then.
Definitely. And were there common personality traits mentioned?
Yes, the study did note some things. Tendencies like maybe being a bit naive or gullible, sometimes shyness, sensitivity, maybe a lack of self-confidence,
Hmm.
but also idealism, a searching nature, people genuinely looking for meaning, maybe a better way to live.
And for the people in this specific study, remember they were in Bible-based groups, having some kind of existing spiritual belief, often Christian faith, that was universal among them.
Right, and sometimes they mentioned being dissatisfied with mainstream churches too, feeling they were, I don't know, apathetic or out of touch.
Yeah, so the new group's energy, its perceived idealism, maybe its radical commitment, that felt more real, more genuine.
So we're looking for something deeper, spiritually speaking.
Exactly. And the group itself, its appeal is huge. It offers purpose, absolute certainty, and in these cases, guaranteed salvation. Plus, that immediate, intense friendliness from members, it's a powerful draw. Feels like you've instantly found your people.
Is it always like a lightning bolt conversion moment? Or can it be slower?
The sources suggest it's often more gradual, an incremental attachment, not always one big event. And yeah, there are definitely active recruitment tactics used. They're often designed to tap into those vulnerabilities we talked about, the needs people have at that specific time.
Okay, so someone's drawn in, maybe feeling vulnerable, looking for purpose, community. What happens once they're fully inside? What's life like then?
Well, the study really emphasizes how complex it is. It's not one simple thing, but one really powerful theme that kept coming up from participants was this constant feeling of God as audience.
God as audience. What did they mean by that?
It means living with this pervasive sense that you're always being watched, judged, evaluated. Not just by God directly, but through the filter of the group, its rules, its leader. It creates this immense pressure to conform absolutely everything, thoughts, actions, everything.
Wow. And this is where, as you said, it gets really interesting, this intense us and them dynamic that both sources highlight.
Absolutely critical. The outside world is painted in very negative terms. It's bad, it's corrupt, maybe even, controlled by Satan,
Hmm.
especially in these religious groups. The group, on the other hand, sees itself as God's elite, the only ones with the real truth.
And often they have some kind of urgent mission, right? Like saving the world or fundraising.
Yes, a shared messianic mission.
Yeah.
And members are told that participating in this mission is crucial, not just for the world, but for their own salvation. It ties their personal fate to the group's goals.
And the leaders.
Hmm.
They must play a huge role in all this.
Absolutely central. They're typically seen as having divine authority or at least unquestionable insight. They demand total subordination, total conformity to their rules, which are often incredibly strict and sometimes just impossible to meet.
The study mentioned double standards too, didn't it? Like demanding honesty inside but encouraging lies outside.
Yeah, that was striking. Demanding absolute truthfulness between members, but then actively teaching them to deceive outsiders, maybe family, authorities. The justification is that the group's mission is so important that, well, the ends justify the means.
That's quite a contradiction to live with. And this control, it goes way beyond just beliefs, right? It gets into everyday life.
Oh, completely. It can be incredibly pervasive, dictating schedules, activities, where people live.
Where they live.
Yeah, participants reported being moved around constantly, sometimes even to different countries. One reason mentioned was to prevent them from forming deep, independent friendships with other members that might compete with loyalty to the leader or the group.
Wow, moving people just to control their connections. That's intense.
It is. And it extends into really personal areas: diet, sex, marriage. The study gave examples ranging from arranged marriages dictated by the leader to total prohibition of sex to, even in some groups, mandated promiscuity. It all depends on the leader's rules.
And isolation from the outside world is key.
Crucial. Cutting off ties with family, old friends. It makes the group your only source of information, your only support system, your entire reality.
So you're cut off from any alternative views or emotional backup.
Exactly. And they use various methods to keep that control tight. Instilling fear is a big one. Fear of God's punishment, fear of the leader's anger, fear of the evil outside world.
What else?
Confession sessions were mentioned. They sound helpful, but the study found they often just increased vulnerability and dependence on the group for forgiveness. And just constant secrecy and deception, both internally about how things really work and externally toward anyone asking questions. Participants literally talked about being coached on how to lie to police or family.
It sounds incredibly stressful, just exhausting and isolating. What does that do to people emotionally and psychologically?
Oh, emotional distress is really common, as you'd expect. Depression, huge amounts of guilt and shame, lots of inner conflict. That constant battle between your own gut feelings or doubts and what the group demands you believe and do.
Yeah.
And over time, a deep sense of dependence develops, feeling powerless over your own life.
The study talked about something called the identity switch, which sounds pretty fundamental.
Yes, that's a really key finding. Participants described literally changing who they were, their core beliefs, their behavior, their whole sense of self. They didn't just lose their old identity, they actively took on the group's identity. They became member X, first and foremost.
And critical thinking, that gets shut down somehow.
It seems actively discouraged, even denigrated. Questioning the group or the leader is seen as a sign of weakness, lack of faith, or even demonic influence. The study pointed out how keeping members constantly busy with group activities leaves zero time for quiet reflection or independent thought.
Right. No space to even process doubts.
And the essay adds an interesting point. Individuals often participate in reinforcing this themselves. They might double down on the beliefs, even when faced with contradictory evidence, because their whole sense of purpose and self is now tied up with the group. Questioning the group means questioning themselves at the deepest level.
So even if a little doubt creeps in, everything is set up to make you push it away.
Pretty much. But, despite all this pressure and distress, the sources also point out there are things that act as rewards, things that keep people invested.
Rewards. Given everything you've described, that feels surprising. What kind of rewards?
Well, sometimes just the relief from that inner conflict once you fully commit. That powerful sense of purpose we talked about, being part of something huge and important, and that initial feeling of belonging, that intense community.
Ah, okay. The initial draw.
Exactly. Even if it's manipulated, that need for community and friendship can feel genuinely met, at least for a while. The study participants mentioned feeling euphoric sometimes, especially when they felt approved of by the leader or part of this special group effort. It provides a kind of solace.
Okay, so life inside is this really complicated mix. Intense control, psychological pressure, fear, but also purpose, belonging, maybe even moments of euphoria. So given how totally consuming that group identity becomes, leaving must be incredibly difficult.
Immensely difficult. Both sources really stress that it's rarely a clean break. It's usually a long, drawn-out process.
How does it typically start, that process of leaving?
Often it starts internally, Just small moments of thinking for yourself again, beginning to quietly question things you'd accepted without a second thought.
What kind of things might trigger that first little crack?
Sometimes it's just sheer exhaustion from trying to live up to those impossible standards.
Mm.
Or the mental toll of constantly suppressing doubts just becomes too much. Other times, a specific event happens, maybe hypocrisy they witness, or a failed prophecy, something that creates a dissonance they just can't ignore anymore.
And when someone does start showing doubt or says they want to leave, how do the groups react?
The study participants described the reaction as universally negative, harsh even. The group instantly closes ranks. Ostracism, rejection. That whole group is family thing flips completely into abandonment.
Wow.
Often accompanied by threats, you'll lose your salvation, you'll be ruined socially, terrible things will happen to you in the evil outside world.
That must be terrifying, especially after the group has been your entire world for years.
It's profoundly traumatic. And the study also mentions some exits aren't even voluntary. People get kicked out
Really? Why?
for challenging the leader too much, maybe becoming problematic. Or sometimes if someone has a mental breakdown, they might be seen as no longer useful or compliant and just discarded.
So, what actually helps people get out then? If the internal and external pressure to stay is so immense.
Having contact with trusted others outside the group seems vital. Maybe former members who really understand what they're going through.
Yeah.
Sometimes professionals, therapists, counselors, exit counselors.
Okay.
And encountering external information can be huge.
Yeah.
Reading about manipulation tactics, finding critical information about that specific group, or even just having conversations with people who offer a different perspective. One person in this study said a really simple comment from an outsider, basically. A true religion wouldn't make you feel this guilty all the time. That was a major turning point for them. Just planting a seed of doubt.
Okay, so someone manages the incredibly difficult task of leaving. What's the aftermath like? How do they even begin to pick up the pieces?
The emotional fallout is huge, and it often lasts a long time. Difficulty coping is common. Intense grief, not just for the lost beliefs, but for the lost community, the lost friendships, loneliness, frustration, anger. Depression is very common. And deep, deep guilt and shame, especially if their involvement harmed their children or alienated family. That's a heavy burden.
And practical stuff too, I imagine.
Absolutely. A real sense of disorientation. The study had examples of people who came out and were totally lost in the modern world.
Yeah.
They didn't know about major news events, didn't know how to do basic everyday things because they'd been so isolated.
Like time travelers, almost?
Kind of. One participant reportedly asked if Elvis was still singing. Another had never heard of Margaret Thatcher. Time just stopped for them inside that bubble.
Wow. That really drives home the level of isolation. What about the deeper identity issues?
That's a massive challenge. There's often a loss of meaning. The group's mission was everything, now what? A feeling of arrested development, like they missed out on years of normal psychological growth because they were so dependent. And trust. That's huge. A profound lack of trust, not just in others, obviously after being deceived, but critically, in themselves, in their own judgment. How could they have fallen for it? How can they trust themselves to make good choices now? That's a really hard one.
And the group's influence can linger.
Definitely. The mental hold can persist long after leaving. For some, that fear of divine punishment, if they betray the group, doesn't just vanish. It can take years to overcome.
So how does healing even start? How do people come to terms with it all?
A big part is finally fully recognizing the deception and manipulation they were subjected to, and then rationalizing the experience, trying to make sense of how it happened, how they got drawn in, why they stayed. Participants in the study talked about this being essential for self-vindication.
And self-forgiveness.
Crucially, yes,
Yeah.
self-forgiveness. They mentioned consciously working to shift their internal language, moving from thinking of we when referring to the group to thinking of they. It sounds small, but it's about reclaiming their individual identity, drawing that boundary.
Actively separating themselves mentally.
Exactly. And feeling understood by others. People who get it, who don't judge. That's incredibly important. Many former members also find a really strong desire to use their experience to help others. That can become a new source of purpose, a way to reclaim agency.
And do they ever find anything positive came out of it, despite all the trauma?
Surprisingly, yes, some do. The study mentioned people reporting increased resilience, like, if I survive that, I can survive anything. Sometimes a deeper empathy for others who are suffering. And maybe a clearer sense of what's truly important in life, having had everything else stripped away.
So bringing all these personal stories together, they really connect to broader psychological and social principles, don't they?
They absolutely do. This is where concepts from social psychology really shed light on what's happening. Things like social identity theory that helps explain the identity switch, how readily we derive our sense of self from groups, and how powerful that feeling of belonging can be.
And obedience to authority. That seems obvious here.
Incredibly relevant. Stanley Milgram's experiments showed how willing people are to follow orders from someone they see as a legitimate authority figure. Now imagine that authority figure is seen as divinely appointed.
Yeah, the pressure to comply would be immense.
People can abdicate personal responsibility thinking the leader knows best or it's for God's plan. They might believe they're not truly responsible for actions taken under orders.
And just basic group dynamics explain a lot of the control mechanisms.
Yes, absolutely. The creation of that us versus them boundary, the isolation tactics, how conformity is enforced, how dissent is punished or shut down, how information is controlled, creating what some experts call information disease, where members literally only get the group's version of reality.
Which explains why the study argues that just focusing on the individual's problems or childhood isn't enough.
Exactly. It misses the immense power of the situation, the context. While individual factors play a role in who might be susceptible when, the group environment itself exerts powerful psychological force. One participant really pushed back against therapists who only wanted to talk about their childhood, saying, the real issue was the manipulative environment they were trapped in right now.
Right. Focusing only on the individual kind of blames the victim rather than acknowledging the system.
Precisely. And that brings us back to that tricky word cult and the essay's point about ambiguity.
Yeah.
Because these dynamics, strong belief, group conformity, charismatic leadership, they exist in many contexts, not all negative. The essay prompts us to think, when does that strong group identity, that passionate belief, which can feel positive, actually tip over into being harmful? Where is that line?
So wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway for you listening to this? This deep dive really shows that getting involved with, living inside, and leaving these kinds of intense groups is, well, it's incredibly complex.
It is. It's shaped by individual vulnerability, yes, but also profoundly by the group structure, its demands, and by tapping into those really fundamental human needs we all have for belonging, for purpose, for certainty.
It highlights just how powerful group influence can be, how authority can shape our actions, how our whole perception of reality, even our sense of who we are, can be molded by the groups we're part of.
Yeah, whether we call them cults or something else entirely.
So, given how subtle influence and conformity can be in all kinds of groups, maybe here's something to reflect on. How do we, in our own lives, cultivate the awareness, the critical thinking, the strong personal connections outside any single group that help us navigate group pressures and make sure we're genuinely thinking for ourselves?